Welcome to the Corvell Group Confined Space Safety Training Module. The purpose of this training is to increase a worker's ability to identify, avoid, and control hazards associated with confined space entry. The objectives of this training module are as follows. Terms and definitions relating to confined space entry. Facts and figures about confined space entry. OSHA regulations relating to confined space entry. And safe work practices when working with and around confined space entry. Throughout this training module, the following terms will be used: attendant, hole watch, authorized entrant, entry supervisor, confined space, permit required confined space, engulfment, immediately dangerous to life or health, IDLH, rescue service, and retrieval system. The definitions for these terms are as follows. Attendant. An individual stationed outside one or more permit spaces who monitors the authorized entrance and who performs all attendance duties assigned in the employer's permit space program. Authorized entrant. An employee who is authorized by the employer to enter a permit space. Entry supervisor. Responsible for determining if acceptable entry conditions are present at a permit space where entry is planned, for authorizing entry and overseeing entry operations, and for terminating entry as required by this section. Confined space is large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. Has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, for example, tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, hoppers, vaults, and pits are spaces that may have limited means of entry. Confined space is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. Permit required confined space, PRCS. Same initial requirements as a confined space, but also includes: contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. Contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Engulfment. The surrounding and effective capture of a person by a liquid or finely divided, flowable solid substance that can be aspirated to cause death by filling or plugging the respiratory system, or that can exert enough force on the body to cause death by strangulation, constriction, or crushing. Immediately dangerous to life and health, IDLH. Any condition that poses an immediate or delayed threat to life or that would cause irreversible adverse health effects or that would interfere with an individual's ability to escape unaided from a permit space. Rescue service. The personnel designated to rescue employees from permit spaces. Retrieval system. The equipment including a retrieval line, chest or full body harness, wristlets, if appropriate, and a lifting device or anchor, used for non-entry rescue of persons from permit spaces. Why is confined space work considered hazardous? OSHA estimates 224,000 establishments have permit-required confined spaces. OSHA anticipates that compliance with these regulations will avoid 53 worker deaths and injuries. There were 431 confined space incidents with 530 fatalities in the U.S. due to oxygen-deficient and/or toxic atmospheres from 1992 to 2005. From 8/18/2009 to 12/31/2009, there were 36 worker fatalities and 6 worker hospitalizations related to confined spaces. In 2010, there were 63 worker fatalities and 28 hospitalizations related to confined spaces. From 1/1/2011 to 8/1/2011, there were 22 worker fatalities and 3 worker hospitalizations related to confined spaces. Repair and maintenance and cleaning and inspection activities account for almost 1/4 of confined space-related fatalities. Construction and manufacturing industries experience the most fatalities. Many workers are injured and killed each year while working in confined spaces. An estimated 60% of the fatalities have been among untrained rescue personnel. never attempt a confined space rescue. The leading cause of fatalities is asphyxiation. What is asphyxiation? Asphyxiation occurs when there is a severely deficient supply of oxygen to the body. This can occur when oxygen levels are less than 19.5%. Conversely, oxygen enrichment can occur when oxygen levels are greater than 23.5%. Oxygen enrichment lends to an explosive atmosphere. Here are some examples of confined spaces: tanks, manholes, boilers, furnaces, sewers, silos, hoppers, vaults, pipes, tunnels, ducts, bins, and pits. Corval Group classifies all confined spaces as permit required. The safety department must be contacted prior to entry into any confined space. The picture is a small clip from the THA that shows the reminder to call safety prior to entry. There are several hazards to be concerned with when working in and around confined spaces, such as asphyxiation, electrical, mechanical, engulfment, including silos and hoppers, flammable methane, hydrogen, acetylene, propane, and gasoline fumes and toxic materials. There are two main toxic hazards to be concerned with when working in a confined space, and they are carbon monoxide and H2S. Carbon monoxide is a poisonous, colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas. Carbon monoxide is slightly lighter than air. The OSHA PEL, permissible exposure limit, is 50 parts of carbon monoxide per 1 million parts of air, averaged over an 8-hour time period. Some common sources of carbon monoxide are generators, welders, vehicles and trucks, and arc gouging. Remember to position equipment in such a way that the exhaust is not entering the confined space. Some basic signs and symptoms of carbon monoxide exposure are tightness across the chest, headache, fatigue, dizziness, drowsiness, and nausea. Hydrogen sulfide, H2S, is a colorless, flammable, extremely hazardous gas with a rotten egg smell. H2S is heavier than air and may travel along the ground and pool in low-lying areas. The OSHA TWA, time-weighted average, is 10 parts of H2S per 1 million parts of air, averaged over an 8-hour time period. Some common sources of hydrogen sulfide are petroleum refineries, natural gas plants, petrochemical plants, coke oven plants, sewers and sewage treatment plants, pulp and paper operations, and decomposing organic matter. Some basic signs and symptoms of hydrogen sulfide exposure include eye irritation, respiratory irritation, dizziness, headache, loss of consciousness, convulsions, and frostbite if H2S is in liquid form. The picture is of a standard personal 4-gas monitor that Corval uses. Confined space procedures. There is a 10-step process when working in confined spaces, and they are: contact the safety department prior to confined space activities, train all workers that will be involved with the entry, identify the hazards associated with the space and document them on the THA, isolate the space from any and all hazardous energy sources, LOTOTO, ventilate the confined space, complete the permit prior to entry, test the atmosphere prior to entry, and then maintain continuous atmosphere monitoring while entrants are inside the space. The entrant and the attendant need to establish their means of communication. Perform required confined space work, and exiting the confined space and closing out the permit. The safety department must be contacted prior to any confined space work. Step 2. Train all involved with entry. Everyone that will be involved with the confined space entry must be trained prior to entry. Everyone involved will have confined space entry training as a minimum. The attendant, hole watch, will have additional training that will cover the duties of an attendant. Step 3. Identify all hazards. Identify and discuss the hazards associated with the confined space with those involved with the confined space entry. Ask yourself questions such as, what was in the space? How do we isolate the space? How do we ventilate the space? What is it like inside the space? What work is to be done? Could the work to be done make the space more hazardous? Step 4. Isolate the space. Any and all sources of energy need to be identified and isolated. Energy control. Remember to try out the equipment after it is locked out. OSHA is really emphasizing the tryout portion of the lockout, tagout, tryout program. This is an easy step that can and will save lives. The space needs to be emptied of product prior to entry. This can be achieved by methods such as depressurizing, venting, draining, and cleaning. Step 5. Ventilate the space. Confined spaces should have an average of 20 complete air changes per hour. This can be achieved by using mechanical ventilation, like fans and air horns. If necessary, intrinsically safe, explosion-proof ventilation may need to be used. Keep ventilators away from toxic sources such as refueling operations, running machines or equipment, and other chemicals and gases. Step 6. Complete the permit. The permit must be completely filled out and all hazards must be identified on the permit. The entry supervisor must sign off on the permit. Pictured is the top half of the Corval Group Confined Space Entry Permit. Each section of the permit needs to be completely filled out. Pictured is the bottom half of the Corval Group Confined Space Entry Permit. Under specific precautions, it is important to list hazards specific to the confined space and any other PPE requirements that may be necessary. Atmospheric testing is to be done prior to entry, and then continuously when entrants are inside the confined space. Once work is completed, the entry supervisor is required to close out the permit. Step 7. Test the atmosphere. The atmosphere will be continually monitored for the following. Oxygen content should be between 19.5% and 23.5%. Combustibles. LEL must remain below 5%. Toxic gases, carbon monoxide, CO, and hydrogen sulfide, H2S. These percentages are subject to change based on the client's own requirements. Above is an example of the gas instrumentation that Corval Group uses. If the gas instrumentation alarms at any point, use Stop Work Authority, SWA, immediately. The Safety Department must be contacted if gas instrumentation alarms such as O2, LEL, H2S, or CO. Once an alarm sounds, the entrants must evacuate the space, and a new plan will need to be developed. This plan will be developed with the Safety Department and it must result in the atmosphere remaining within the acceptable limits. All employees and subcontractors are empowered, authorized, and obligated by the owners, president, and leadership of Corval Group to stop work at any time for any unsafe condition. All employees and subcontractors are expected to stop working until the hazard or risk has been resolved. The Stop Work Authority can be difficult for employees to embrace because of the fear of losing their job. Be assured that no employee will ever be penalized for using Stop Work Authority. If the monitor alarms for any reason, malfunction or otherwise, it is important to immediately evacuate the confined space. Stop all work activities and inform the entry supervisor of the situation. Do not continue work in the confined space until the situation has been resolved. Step 8. Establish communication with attendant. The attendant and entrants need to determine their means of communication and the frequency of communication. Some examples of common communication methods are radios, may need to be intrinsically safe, line of sight, verbal communication, or other audible noises, like tapping on the side of a vessel. Step 9. Perform the work. Work may begin inside the confined space. During entry and exit from the confined space, be sure to make verbal communication with the attendant so he can update the entry log. If conditions change or new hazards present themselves, use Stop Work Authority, SWA, immediately and evacuate the space. Alert the entry supervisor of the new hazards and update the THA. Safety must be contacted to discuss the new hazards, and a new plan will be developed. Step 10. Exiting the confined space and closing out the permit. Upon exiting the space, let the attendant know you will not be re-entering the space. After all workers have exited the confined space, the permit must be returned to the entry supervisor, so he can close out the permit. Confined space operations are hazardous and present multiple hazards to be concerned with, such as hazardous energy and the need for energy control, lockout, tagout, tryout. Toxic materials can be present in a confined space, like carbon monoxide and H2S, and need to be monitored and/or controlled. And asphyxiation. Confined space entry requires the use of a confined space attendant, hole watch, to monitor the entrance. If abnormal conditions are detected, the hole watch has the authority to evacuate the confined space. Continuous atmospheric monitoring will be done while working in a confined space. Never attempt a confined space rescue. Confined space work is hazardous, but with thorough hazard identification, proper pre-job planning, and continuous hazard assessment by the attendant and entrant, the confined space work can be performed safely. Thank you for participating in the Corval Group Just-in-Time Training Module. Contact your regional safety manager with questions, comments, or concerns.